Hello and welcome to my presentation on the Royal Navy's West Africa Squadron and its operations between 1808 and 1870. Um, this is a rough overview of what we're going to cover in this presentation. First of all, we're going to do an overview on the West Africa Squadron, what it was, its mission. Then we're going to talk about the legal foundation of the West Africa Squadron, abolition in English law, and how that ultimately led to Great Britain committing its naval forces to a essentially 62-year-long campaign to try to abolish the slave trade off the coast of West Africa. Then we're going to talk about enforcement on the high seas and how this was really as Shakespeare would say, "Aye, there's the rub." This was the difficult part of the entire affair, as difficult as it was to actually pass legislation in the English Parliament, which would provide for the abolition of the slave trade. Actually enforcing the abolition of the slave trade on the high seas would be incredibly difficult, and would entail all kinds of complex challenges to the Royal Navy. That's going to be where we're going to spend the bulk of our time. And then finally, we'll finish with a look at the legacy of the West Africa Squadron and how it's remembered, and some current efforts to try to create memorials to the West Africa Squadron in Great Britain. Now, I wanted to start off with this image painted by Franklin Stanwood, an American painter who painted this, in the 1870s, 1878, actually. The title of this work is Slave Ship Evading the Royal Navy. Um, because this image really gives us some ideas of, the challenge. The ocean is a vast area of operations, the West Africa coast. That was really the area of operations for the West Africa Squadron was at least 3,000 miles of coastline, and you're never going to have more than 30 ships out there assigned to that station. That is a huge, huge swath of territory to cover, and patrols out in this part of the world were very lengthy and incredibly difficult. And you're talking about a tropical environment, which is going to be very hard on the ships and on the men. So the West Africa Squadron is going to be considered to be one of the worst postings for the men of the Royal Navy during this period. It's going to be a very, very difficult place to operate, but ultimately an incredibly important mission, which I believe is something that is very much worth remembering for any student of history today. So, an overview. Following Great Britain's abolition of the slave trade, the Royal Navy's West Africa Squadron is going to be tasked with enforcing abolition on the high seas. The Royal Navy's efforts to suppress the slave trade are going to be hampered by so many things: complexities in international maritime law, constantly changing treaties with different nations, insufficient numbers of ships, and the sheer scale of the anti-slavery mission. So I think it's important to go into this with an understanding of the limitations on the West Africa Squadron. The West Africa Squadron's anti slavery mission did not effectively end the slave trade. If anything, it suppressed the slave trade uh, at a considerable cost, both in terms of treasure and lives. On average, 15% of the Royal Navy personnel assigned to the West African Squadron in any given year between 1808 and 1870 became casualties due to enemy action, accidents, or disease. Now, here it's important to note that there are some pretty disparate numbers thrown out by historians and researchers regarding the casualties suffered by the Royal Navy's West Africa Squadron. On the low end, I've seen numbers such as 1,500 or perhaps 2,000 men lost over the course of 62 years of operations. Now, when you do the math on that, that comes out to roughly 30 men a year. But then when you actually read the after action reports that are going to be written by the captains assigned to the West Africa Squadron, and you tally up losses in any given year, you get numbers far in excess of 30 personnel loss per year. Um, there's some numbers that have been thrown out there that say, I mean, they're as high as 17 to 20,000. Since there is such a wide range in the numbers here, I based my research for this presentation mostly on the after action reports provided through some excellent books on the West Africa Squadron, which I will cite at the end. So I think the safer thing as a historian is to go with the primary source documents more than anything. So it's safe to say that about 15% of the Royal Navy's personnel assigned to the West Africa Squadron could easily become casualties in any given year, which is fairly significant. Now, most of those casualties are going to be caused by disease. Tropical diseases are going to be absolutely devastating to a lot of these personnel. And while the West Africa Squadron did not signal the definitive end of the slave trade and slavery itself, I believe it does represent a valiant effort which contributed to the demise of the evil practice of slavery. Now, with our overview out of the way, let's move on to abolition in English law. From chief poacher to gamekeeper. And I think that subtitle is worth explaining because it's important to understand that Great Britain is going to be one of the leading slave trading nations, um, really starting in the 17th century. As Great Britain begins to challenge Spain and Portugal for control of the seas, Great Britain is going to start challenging Spain and Portugal for control of the transatlantic slave trade. And by the middle of the 18th century, nearly 50% of the transatlantic slave trade is going to be carried on British ships. Now, with the First Great Awakening and with the beginning of the abolitionist movement in Great Britain and her colonies, we're going to see a shift that occurs, which is ultimately going to lead to Great Britain going from being one of these leading slave trading nations to being the first major European power to really make a concerted effort to abolish the slave trade. Now, again, it's important to understand this is a context that I try to remind my students of all the time. Slavery is not a uniquely European phenomenon. It's not like the Europeans went to Africa and introduced slavery. Slavery is unfortunately a human problem that has happened. It has taken place basically all over the world. Anywhere where humans are present, slavery has occurred. And for most of recorded history, it seems that slavery has been common. We are now in, I would say, only the third century in which slavery is not common around the world, and yet it is still very much something that happens. Now, as you can see from this map here, the slave trade from the West African coasts is not just going to what will eventually become the southern colonies or the southern states of the United States, but there's a very large number of slaves who are actually being trafficked to Spanish and Portuguese possessions in South America. In particular, Portugal's colony of Brazil is going to be a destination for millions of enslaved Africans. So, in the context of all of this, um, I would like to ask you a question. Which country was the first to ban its own transatlantic slave trade? The correct answer is actually Little Denmark. Denmark in 1792 is going to ban the slave trade, its own transatlantic slave trade, with an effective date of 1803. However, for context, there's always more to the story. Slavery itself is not going to be abolished in the in Denmark's possessions in the West Indies until the 1840s. That's something to bear in mind. Now, when we look at Britain, when does abolition really begin to gather steam in Britain? Um, it really starts with the Somerset case. This is one of the major turning points in the abolitionist movement. In short, um, in 1772, this case comes before the Court of King's Bench in London. And the case is this: there is a young man named James Somerset who was enslaved. He was shipped out of West Africa to the then British colony of Virginia, where he was again enslaved. And then his master takes him from Virginia to England, where James Somerset comes into contact with some abolitionists. Ultimately, James Somerset is going to challenge the legality of his enslavement because in Great Britain, there is no positive law um, protecting the institution of slavery, whereas in the British colony of Virginia, there was positive law protecting the institution of slavery. So this case goes before the Court of King's Bench, and the Chief Justice of that court, Lord Mansfield, is going to try to be very careful in the decision that he issues, and he is going to ultimately lead a decision which is very narrow. But essentially, the point of it all is that slavery has no protection under English common law. So, slavery is not protected under the English Constitution. Slavery is only possible in those parts of the empire that have positive law through colonial legislatures that um, basically approve of the practice. But in England itself, with the absence of that positive law, slavery is in very, very um, in a very vulnerable position. It's in a legal gray zone where it's really not protected under the English Constitution. So again, this is a narrow decision. It's been widely misinterpreted, and it was misinterpreted at the time as somehow signaling the end of slavery um, in England and throughout its empire. It's not, but it is a decision which ultimately undermines the institution of slavery within the British Empire, and it's going to give a lot of support to the abolitionist cause. And it is going to cause a tremendous amount of consternation um, amongst British subjects who possess slaves. And it's important to note that in the American experience, the American Revolution, there are going to be many um, American colonists in the southern colonies who decide to join the patriot movement against Great Britain for the American Revolution, largely because they think that, well, slavery's days are numbered within the British Empire. And I don't say that in any way to taint the American Revolution. Obviously, that is a complex topic and nuanced topic, and it's outside of the scope of this presentation. However, this is an important context that is sometimes missing when we talk about the story of the American Revolution. Now, the Somerset case is massively significant because the Somerset case really is, it sends a clear signal that slavery is definitely in jeopardy as an institution within the British Empire. And certainly slavery itself is not protected within um, Britain itself. Now, as the abolitionist movement gains steam through the efforts of people like Granville Sharp, Ignatius Sancho, who's actually going to be one of the first um, free black men of note in Great Britain. Um, Oladu Iquano, the same thing. John Newton, a former slaver himself, who is going to experience a religious experience. He's going to be a born again Christian who will dedicate his life to the church and the abolitionist cause. Of course, Thomas Clarkson, and perhaps the most famous of all the British abolitionists, William Wilberforce, who's going to leverage his connections in Parliament and his connections to William Pitt the Younger, one of the greatest prime ministers Great Britain has ever had. The abolitionist movement is going to yield results in Great Britain as we move through the 18th century. This poem here: we have no slaves at home, then why abroad? Slaves cannot breathe in England. If their lungs receive our air, that moment they are free. They touch our country, and their shackles fall. That's noble, and bespeaks a nation proud and jealous of the blessing. Spread it then, and let it circulate through every vein. While there are certainly, that was written by William Cowper in 1785, while there are certainly all kinds of interests within the British Parliament, within the British economy, which are pushing for slavery to be protected as an institution, the abolitionist cause is gaining a tremendous amount of steam. And by 1807, the Slave Trade Act is passed through Parliament, which essentially bans British subjects from participating in the slave trade. And at this point, Great Britain is going to start leveraging its diplomatic power to try and force other nations into making similar agreements. As a matter of fact, President Thomas Jefferson of the United States is going to sign a treaty with Great Britain in 1808, which is going to basically make the United States a party to this agreement of abolishing the slave trade. However, it's important here to point out the difference between the slave trade and slavery itself. And of course, just because you make something illegal doesn't mean that people are going to stop doing it. In Great Britain, the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833 will finish what the Slave Trade Act of 1807 started. The Slavery Abolition Act of 1833 is going to abolish slavery throughout the colonies of Great Britain, with the notable exception of the colonies administered by the British East India Company. Now, later on in the 1840s, those exceptions would be done away with. Now, that is a super fast overview of abolition in English law, but that really explains why the West Africa Squadron is created in 1808, following the British abolition of the slave trade. Now it falls to Great Britain, and specifically Great Britain's Royal Navy, to enforce this ban on the slave trade. Great Britain is, well, the Royal Navy is really the only organ of the government of Great Britain that can do anything about the slave trade. Because, again, the Royal Navy, together with Britain's merchant fleet, and the connection between those two things is, I mean, they're very intrinsically linked in the Age of Sail, especially. Uh, the Royal Navy had been very instrumental in cementing Britain's position as a major slave trading nation. So now, with the abolitionist movement in Parliament and throughout Britain itself, British society, now the Royal Navy is going to become an instrument to try to enforce that on the high seas. Now, the first patrol of the West Africa Squadron is going to take place in 1808. And if you know your history, which I know that you do, there's a lot going on in 1808. Notably, um, stuff connected to this guy right here, Napoleon Bonaparte. We are in the midst of the Napoleonic Wars. And Britain's powerful 795 ship Royal Navy is spread very, very thin because of the Napoleonic Wars. So at its creation in 1808, the West Africa Squadron is going to consist of only two. Yes, that's right, two ships. The frigate, the HMS Solebay, and the sloop, the HMS Derwent. Now, remember, we said this is like a 3,000-mile coastline that's going to have to be patrolled with two ships. So this first patrol, I hope you understand. I hope you can. It's pretty obvious, right? Is gonna. It's not going to be very effective because you only have two ships. Now, the West Africa Squadron is going to receive authorization to seize any pirate vessel or any ship with false or suspect papers. Now, that sounds like they have a lot of latitude. However, as we're going to discuss here in the next couple slides, there are all kinds of limitations, all kinds of caveats to that. As far as incentives for the crews involved, a bounty of 60, 30, and 10 pounds would be paid for every man, woman, and child set free. And this bounty would ultimately be distributed amongst the officers and crews of the HMS Solebay and the HMS Derwent. Here I have a image of a scale model of a cruiser class 18-gun Royal Navy brig sloop like the HMS Derwent. Let me explain something about the ships assigned to the West Africa Squadron. The British, with their proud naval heritage, have a rating system for their warships. Essentially, you have first, second, third, fourth, fifth, and sixth rating ships. So a first, second, or third rate vessel is considered a frontline ship of the line, a man of war, a ship that is considered to be essentially part of the A team, right? Um, then you have the reserve fourth, fifth, and sixth rate ships, which are still warships, of course, and they're still very, very important for escort duty and convoy duty and all kinds of other tasks. But they're not considered to be, they're not the best. Now, a sloop or a brig sloop isn't even on that rating system. It's too small to be part of that rating system. So it's not even a sixth rate ship. Um, it fits into a category basically below those capital ship ratings. The HMS Derwent is one of those ships. Now, during the Napoleonic Wars, the Royal Navy is going to build literally hundreds of these cruiser class brig sloops because they're extremely useful. But it's important to understand that the ships assigned, there's all just two of them, but the ships assigned to the West Africa Squadron, basically throughout its career, throughout its history, until really starting in the 1840s, are typically going to be kind of vessels that are considered to be unsuitable for frontline use in ship to ship warfare against European opponents. Under the initial command of Commodore Edward Columbine, the West Africa Squadron is going to operate out of Freetown, Sierra Leone. Later on, there's going to be a naval station established at Freetown. Initially, HMS Solbay and HMS Derwent are only authorized to stop and board British flagged vessels, only British flagged vessels. Remember, we said that vessels with suspect papers could be stopped. Well, you're not going to find out the papers are suspect until you've boarded them, which means that if you board a vessel that is flying, for example, a Portuguese flag, or perhaps of course, they're stopping French flag vessels because Great Britain's at war with France. But if you stop a vessel flagged with, any other flag apart from the British flag, you are running the risk, as this Royal Navy captain, you're running the risk of perhaps creating a diplomatic incident and bringing reprimands upon yourself, because certainly British captains were subject to being reprimanded for overstepping their boundaries. So I hope you understand that obviously is going to limit what ships are actually being stopped by the West Africa Squadron on its first patrol. And we haven't even talked about how the West Africa Squadron really wasn't going to mess with Portuguese ships. And once Great Britain exits the slave trade, Portugal is going to resume its position as the leading slave trading nation. Here we have an image of a vessel like the HMS Solbay. This is a fifth rate, so remember it's rated from 1 through 6, and this is a fifth rate Royal Navy frigate. So it's a powerful ship, but it's still not considered to be a ship of the line. The crew on this vessel would have consisted of 250 officers and men. Speaking of all the limitations, all of the complexities of maritime law that we referenced earlier, Portugal is going to become the dominant slave trading power after Great Britain's exit from the trade. And as an ally of Britain in the Napoleonic Wars, Portuguese ships are not subject to search and seizure by the West Africa Squadron until much later on. We'll talk about that later. So again, there's all kinds of red tape. There's all kinds of bureaucratic pitfalls attached to the West Africa Squadron's operations, basically preventing them from being effective. After an 1810 treaty, the West Africa Squadron is going to be able to police Portuguese flagged vessels. Nevertheless, Portugal is still going to be able to legally trade in slaves from its own African possessions, its substantial African possessions. Portuguese ships are estimated to have transported as many as 2.2 million captives between 1808 and 1867. And for most of that time, the West Africa Squadron really can't do anything about it because of the limitations placed on them through treaties. Now, that's going to change in the 1840s, but the point I'm trying to make here is that there are all kinds of limitations on the West Africa Squadron, unfortunately. Through the efforts of Great Britain, all signatories of the Congress of Vienna, which I'm sure you know ended the Napoleonic Wars, all signatories to the Congress of Vienna are going to have to be committed to the eventual abolition of the slave trade. Keyword eventual. Even though these European powers, France, Spain, Portugal, are all going to commit themselves to the eventual abolition of the slave trade, enforcing that abolition is going to be very difficult for the West Africa Squadron due to innumerable loopholes in international political and maritime agreements. And also the fact that, well, let's say that eventually Portugal agrees to the abolition of the slave trade. Well, what's going to prevent a Portuguese slave trading captain to just run up American flag on his ship? The United States is going to be notoriously resistant to any British efforts to police its own shipping. So we're going to see slave trading vessels basically exploit all of these loopholes at every opportunity. So that's something to remember. After the Napoleonic Wars, the West Africa Squadron is going to grow considerably to 6 ships. However, that's still only 6 ships to police a 3,000-mile stretch of shoreline. Still not nearly enough. Um, a formal naval station is going to be established in Sierra Leone in 1819 at the time of this gentleman right here, Commodore Sir George Collier, um, during his service with the West Africa Squadron. So the West Africa Squadron grows after the end of the Napoleonic Wars, but we still have not reached um, the strength, the numbers of ships necessary to really make any noticeable impact on the transatlantic slave trade. Until 1835, slave ships had to be captured with slaves on board in order to be seized by the Royal Navy. So, again, this is a massive limitation because imagine you're a Royal Navy West Africa Squadron captain and you stop a ship and you board that ship. We'll talk about the anatomy of an interdiction here later and just exactly what that consisted of. But you board the ship and you find all of the shackles that would be used to uh, restrain all of the enslaved persons on board, and you find the very, very, very large cooking pots that would be used to prepare the meager rations that these enslaved Africans would be fed, and you find all the signs indicating that this is a slave ship. But unless you find slaves on the ship, you can't do anything. You can't seize the ship. You can't stop them. So again, this is a massive limitation because instead of really preventing the slave trade from getting any traction, we're the Royal Navy's West Africa Squadron is essentially playing catch up, at least until the laws change. Due process is going to require Royal Navy crews to gather intelligence, capture slave ships' papers, and convince mixed commission admiralty courts to rule in their favor in order to seize the slave ships and then be able to destroy or repurpose the slave ships and collect the bounties on the freed slaves. By the way, a note about these mixed commission admiralty courts. Great Britain again is using diplomatic power, so they are convincing Spain to send Spanish judges to sit on these courts alongside their British counterparts. And they're convincing Portugal to do the same thing. So now, as a British sea captain, as a British Royal Navy captain in the West Africa Squadron, let's say you seize a ship um, off the Bight of Benin. Um, Now you have to sail the ship. Let's imagine it's a Spanish flag vessel. You have to sail the ship to, let's say, Sierra Leone. And now you have to convince not just a British admiralty judge that this was a slave ship, but you have to also plead your case to a Spanish judge as well. Now, again, this is difficult. This is quite a task. So for the West Africa Squadron, it's not just about sailing around and capturing the ships, but they have to do the legal groundwork to ultimately make sure that they're going to be supported on the legal side of things. Now, we talked about the fact that initially these West Africa Squadron ships have to catch slave ships with slaves on board. As you can imagine, this is going to word of this is going to spread, and the unscrupulous, morally bankrupt people who would be slave ship captains are going to have no problem throwing their slaves overboard if it means avoiding punishment. Um, so we're gonna see horrible. Really, this some of the worst examples of just the worst sides of humanity on display here, where helpless enslaved Africans will be thrown overboard to die a horrible death by slave ship captains who are trying to escape, or even if they're boarded, say, "Hey, there's no slaves on board. You can't do anything about this." As you can probably imagine, this is going to be incredibly frustrating to the crews of the West Africa Squadron. There are many, many accounts in some of the books that I read in preparation for this presentation, particularly The Royal Navy versus the Slavers by Bernard Edwards. You read all these firsthand accounts of these Royal Navy officers and men who are assigned to the West Africa Squadron, and they're relatively indifferent towards the practice of slavery. And yet, after they witness things like what is being depicted in this image here, they come back from service in the West Africa Squadron as devoted abolitionists because they've seen they've looked at evil in the face, and they know what it looks like, and they know how awful it is. They've boarded slave ships and found these poor souls crammed on board in horrendous conditions. Um, so I think it's interesting to note that being assigned to the West Africa Squadron is going to have I don't think it's the type of assignment that any man can go to and then come back unchanged from. Um, It seems like we've been talking about limitations on the West Africa Squadron now for several slides, but there are a lot of limitations on the West Africa Squadron. Let's talk about the limitations in terms of material, war materials available to them. Many West Africa Squadron ships are older and relatively slow designs, which are ill suited for chasing down fast slave ships. Let's stop for a second and talk about these slave ships. This picture right here depicts the Californian, which is a replica of an 1847 Baltimore Clipper. It's called the Baltimore Clipper because they're built, a lot of them in Baltimore, along the east coast of the United States. These ships are favored by slave traders because they are fast and they have the ability to outrun most large military sailing ships in the mid to late 19th century. The British are famously going to say, and the British know a thing or two about building ships. They're gonna say that these American-made Baltimore Clippers are just they have too much sail. They are relatively unstable. They can get knocked over in a squall. Um, that's part of what makes them so fast. Of course, they're also well, it's very dangerous to operate them, particularly if they're overloaded, and particularly if you are trying to make it through awful weather. Um, Eventually, we're going to see that the Royal Navy is going to be very happy to seize some of these ships and repurpose them into slave hunters. Um, Basically, ships going after the slave trading ships. Every time the Royal Navy does that, the Royal Navy is going to reduce the amount of sail surface area on these ships in an effort to try and make them more stable, even if it came at the loss of some speed. Um, Again, the West Africa Squadron ships are always spread thin across West Africa's vast, vast coastline. Now, let's talk about the hardships of the sea. As you can imagine, sailing in the age of sail is going to entail all kinds of difficulties, but particularly off the coast of Africa, um, close to the equator in tropical waters. Malaria, yellow fever, and other mosquito borne tropical diseases are constant threats. On top of that, we have treacherous weather conditions and shark infested waters and the dangers of boarding actions in close combat. Ultimately, taking down these slave trading ships is going to entail boarding them, and that is almost always going to entail close combat, and there is no combat like close combat. So that's part of the reason why when we look at the casualty numbers, um, a loss rate of only 30 men per year seems so extremely light. It's really hard to believe that, especially when you compare that to the after action reports being written by the Royal Navy captains. Um, let's talk about crewmen, because on the last slide we talked about the fact that tropical diseases are going to be a constant danger to the sailors of the West Africa Squadron. For this purpose, and also for the purpose of being able to navigate some of the treacherous areas close to the coast, and maybe even some of the rivers in West Africa, the Royal Navy is going to make use of crewmen. These are African sailors who are both indigenous crew from the vicinity of Sierra Leone and also resettled liberated slaves. They're going to be employed by the West Africa Squadron. Um, they're prized as skilled sailors who have excellent navigational expertise. And this is an interesting example of how there are going to be crewmen who serve with the Royal Navy in the anti-slavery patrols, and there's other groups of crewmen who are actually going to serve. Um, they're going to work with the slavers, um, helping them navigate the treacherous areas around West Africa, and sometimes helping them elude the Royal Navy's patrols. In any case, this is a fascinating aspect of the story that I really would like to find more sources on for later research. What happens to the freedmen? What happens to the enslaved Africans who are liberated by the Royal Navy? Well, most of them are going to be resettled in Sierra Leone. Sierra Leone, again, being the site of the Admiralty Court, is kind of a clearinghouse for the ships that are seized and also the men and women and children that are rescued from the slaving ships. Now, once in Sierra Leone, um, the enslaved persons who were freed by the Royal Navy are gonna have several options. Now, again, this is one of those situations in history where you look at the options and you think, man, are those the only options? Um, they're going to have the option to volunteer to be shipped to the British West Indies as bonded laborers. And that is going to, of course, cause considerable controversy. Back then and today, of course, when you look at it and you say, well, hang on, you were freed, but now you're being sent off as a bonded laborer. Um, Spain and France, in particular, are going to accuse Great Britain of not going after the slave trade on moral grounds, but just as a form of economic warfare against European powers that were still engaged in the trade. Um, at the time, people in Parliament are going to criticize the fact that some of these freed Africans are then shipped to the West Indies and say that that's just a ploy on the part of the sugar interest from the West Indies in Parliament to get more labor. Um, there's actually a fascinating article that I cited here. It's in the works cited slide at the very end, which talks about kind of some of the nuance and complexity attached to this. Um, it's important to understand that being being a bonded laborer was not altogether uncommon at this time, and it was quite common for not well, not just former slaves, but I mean Europeans to cross the Atlantic as bonded laborers and then have to pay off their passage across the Atlantic. Again, this is something that is very nuanced. What if you didn't want to do that? You could also go free in the colony, and now you'd have to fend for yourself in an area that was probably unfamiliar to you. Again, a lot of the former slaves are not going to be landed close to where they were taken because there's all kinds of complexity in that. Is there ongoing tribal warfare? Is there a good chance they'll just be recaptured again by slavers? So again, this is all of this is really an imperfect solution, isn't it? Um, but and again, this is not a exhaustive analysis of what would happen to the freedmen, but Sierra Leone is typically where most of them would be settled, even if it was only temporary. Now, let's talk about the anatomy of an interdiction. How exactly is the Royal Navy going to stop these slavers and take them down? Well, first of all, the Royal Navy ships are going to have to be on patrol almost constantly, right? They're only stopping to resupply. They're patrolling. There's going to be not controversy, there's going to be debate between different commanders of the West Africa Squadron on whether or not it's better to have close patrol or close blockade close to the coast. This is going to be more effective. At the same time, it opens up the crewmen of the West Africa Squadron, um, the European crewmen mostly, it makes them more susceptible to disease, right? British captains are going to realize it's not a good idea to be close to the coast at dawn and dusk when the mosquitoes are, capable of flying out to them. But they're going to find this out through hard experience and through losing all kinds of men to tropical diseases. So there's the close blockade or close patrol close to the slaving centers or slaving stations in the West African coast, and then of course there's patrolling out at sea, which is safer in terms of, well, mosquitoes can't fly out to you, but it's also not as effective because now you have more space to cover. Now, regardless of where you're patrolling, whether you're close in or far out, once a ship has spotted a possible slaver, an intercept has to be made, right? And the Royal Navy ship will be on an intercept course and try to overtake the alleged slave ship. And there's going to be an exchange. The Royal Navy ship is going to hail the suspected slave ship. If it's a slave ship, it's probably going to lead to an exchange of fire. And at this point, the Royal Navy gun crews are going to have to be very judicious. Now, imagine you are on a moving ship, a moving gun platform, trying to hit a moving target on the high seas with 18th or even 19th century weapons. These are not precision weapons. And at the same time, you've got to be careful because you don't want to sink the slave ship. The Royal Navy ships were fully aware of the fact that if they sank the slave ship, they probably don't have space on board their own ship to take on slaves if the slaves are, indeed on board that slave ship. So what would they aim at? Mostly the sails, the masts, the rigging. Um, Even if you manage to take out the masts, now you have to board, and that's where the close combat comes in. Boarding actions would take place. Oftentimes, the Royal Navy ship would lower its boats, its jolly boats or its gig boats. These are small boats equipped with sails that could take boarding parties from the frigate or the brig sloop to the slave ship. And at that point, once the Royal Navy crew gets on board, they have to duke it out with the slave crew, not the slave crew, the slave ship crew, um, if they choose to offer resistance. And again, the punishments that could be levied against the crews of these slave ships varied. Um, they could be heavy fines, or if the legal argument could be made before the Admiralty Court that they were engaging in a degree of piracy, um, there could even be, something like a death sentence. So it depends really on so many different factors how much resistance these slave crews would offer, right? Now, once the slave ship is captured, you now have to have a prize crew. The Royal Navy would have to detach some of its men to serve as a prize crew on board the captured vessel. And at that point, they can sail the captured vessel to an admiralty court where they would essentially make a legal argument, make a legal case, present evidence. Here are the slaves that we freed. Here is all of the slaving equipment. Um, and then at that point, once the Admiralty Court had ruled in their favor, they would release freed captives. And again, this is why, with one of the main Admiralty Courts in Sierra Leone, this is why so many of the freed slaves are resettled in Sierra Leone. At this point, they released the freed slaves and they would either destroy or repurpose the slave vessel. In many cases, the best thing to do was just to destroy the slave vessel, because if you sold it on the open market, there's a really good chance it's going to end up in the hands of slavers again. But as we're going to see in the case of one particular vessel, the HMS Black Joke, some of these slave vessels, former slave vessels, are going to be repurposed for use by the Royal Navy itself, and they're going to become quite effective as part of the anti-slave patrol. Again, speaking of the HMS Black Joke, this was formerly a Brazilian slave ship named Enriqueta. And this is a painting by Nicholas Matthew Condy from 1829 of the HMS Black Joke, which is the smaller ship here, firing on the Spanish slaver El Almirante. And if you look at this here closely, let me go to the next slide because I know that I have a better image here. You can see there's all these holes in the sails and the rigging is damaged and it looks like this mast is leaning. It And again, look at the distance of the ships, and of course, this is an artist's impression, right? But based on the firsthand accounts that are used by a lot of the sources that I used for this presentation, it makes sense that the Royal Navy ships would try to get as close as possible while under fire themselves to make good shots on the masts and the rigging and the sails of these slave vessels to essentially slow them down and stop them. Remember, these are sail-powered vessels. Let's talk about the HMS Black Joke. One thing to kind of get out of the way right away: the HMS Black Joke. Where's that name come from? It is named after a popular song of the period, and it's actually quite an obscene innuendo. It's fairly surprising, I suppose, to our modern sensibilities that the Royal Navy would allow a ship of the Royal Navy with HMS, Her Majesty's ship, um, out in front of it to be named after a popular kind of bawdy song. But hey, I guess the Royal Navy was a much earthier institution back then. The HMS Black Joke is going to participate in the capture of at least 16 slave ships, and it's going to free a total of nearly 4,000 enslaved Africans. So this is a relatively short career, 1827 to 1832. We're talking about 5 years. In those 5 years, the HMS Black Joke is going to be very, very effective. Again, part of the reason why it's so effective is that it's very fast. It can catch up to the slave ships. It's very lightly armed, but it's got the speed. And again, the speed combined with the fantastic gunnery of the Royal Navy, the Royal Navy's discipline under fire, most of the time the Royal Navy crews are going to be very much outnumbered when they board a much larger slave ship. Remember, most of the Royal Navy boarding parties are getting to the other ship through a small boat, which means the numbers are limited. They're almost always going to be outnumbered, but they are usually going to win. They're going to succeed because of their unit cohesion and their fighting discipline. Now, the HMS Black Joke is very successful. Unfortunately, in 1832, she is found to have rotten timbers, and she is essentially condemned. She's found to be unfit to be a ship in the Royal Navy, and she's burned. And of course, this is met with quite a lot of sadness on the part of her crew and the other ships of the West Africa Squadron. Upon her decommissioning, a Royal Navy officer is going to declare that she was a ship which has done more towards putting an end to the vile traffic in slaves than all the ships of the station put together, which is certainly very, very high praise. And here you have a depiction from a contemporary publication from the 1820s, late 1820s, talking about the Black Joke and several of her prizes, the ships that she helped capture. Now let's talk about how things start changing to where the Royal Navy actually becomes much more effective in the 1840s, and really we see the marriage of naval power and diplomacy, and that's been going on since the beginning, right? But now we're starting to approach a period of time that some historians call Pax Britannica, right, where Great Britain becomes essentially the naval power. She is no longer having to contend with near peer adversaries. Great Britain has more or less established its dominance of the seas. And during this time, through the leadership of men like the two gentlemen that you see before you right now, on over here we have the Honorable Joseph Denman, who is going to serve as a captain in the West Africa Squadron before he will become a vice admiral and the actual commander of the West Africa Squadron. He is a rare figure who actually sought out service in the West Africa Squadron due to the fact that he was a committed abolitionist, as was his father. And here we have Henry John Temple, the third Viscount Palmerston, who is going to serve as the UK's foreign secretary. For a great many years, and he's going to serve in all kinds of other positions within the British government. But for the purposes of this presentation, we're going to focus on his impact as the foreign secretary. Um, what changes? What changes in the 1840s that leads to increased effectiveness for the West Africa Squadron? Well, several things. Number one, Leveraging diplomatic power, we are going to see the addition of the equipment clause to treaties between Great Britain and other European nations. Essentially, what this means is that we no longer have to find slaves on board a slave ship to seize the slave ship. Just finding equipment for slaving on board a ship would now make that ship subject to seizure by the Royal Navy. So this is a very common sense thing, right? This is more effective policing and enforcement. But it's not until the 1840s that Great Britain really has the diplomatic power to to cajole other European powers into this agreement. Now, as Great Britain's diplomatic power and political prowess begins to grow, Great Britain is going to employ more aggressive tactics. And Joseph Denman is going to be a great embodiment of those more aggressive tactics. We'll talk about it in the next couple of slides, but he is actually going to start carrying out raids on slave stations in the West African coast. He is going to destroy the infrastructure built up by Spanish and European slavers, Portuguese slavers. It's important to note that at this point, and almost immediately after uh, Great Britain's abolishment of the slave trade, British slave trading captains, British subjects involved in the trade, are going to rapidly exit the trade, or they will suddenly become Spanish or Portuguese, because of course they're going to have multiple sets of papers for their ships, and they're going to try to just change their flags. And it's important to note too that as we enter this Pax Britannica period where Great Britain is really, for lack of a better term, bullying other European nations into um, agreeing to things like the equipment clause. Well, we've got the Americans. Um, the United States is going to be very resistant to British influence. Um, no surprise, given the fact that we rebelled against them. And all of a sudden, a lot of these sea captains who had previously flown maybe even a British flag and then later a Portuguese or a Spanish flag, well, they'll suddenly become American and they'll start flying the Stars and Stripes in an effort to avoid interdiction on the part of the West Africa Squadron. But in any case, um, we see more diplomatic pressure on European and African polities. Great Britain is at the same time in the 1840s going to start trying to make treaties and agreements with some of the African slave kingdoms that are, the African kingdoms and polities that are providing um, slaves for the European transatlantic slave trade. They're going to try to, Great Britain is going to try to convince them, or certainly in some cases coerce them, into exporting other things, things like palm oil or other products, uh, as a alternative to trafficking in humans. Another major development that happens at this time, and before I move on from that last point, it's important to note we are not yet at the point of this, the scramble for Africa, but we're getting closer. And it's worth noting that yes, there's certainly going to be some there's a place to argue for Great Britain using political power to help suppress the slave trade, and at the same time, we're going to see some of that political power also be leveraged to exploit um, uh, African people. So again, it's just there's such a nuanced topic, right? There's so much to it. But moving back to this, another thing that leads to increased effectiveness on the part of the West Africa Squadron during this time is that the West Africa Squadron will now begin operations below the equator, because previously, before the 1840s, most of the treaties signed with the other European powers, most of those treaties really only gave Britain jurisdiction in the North Atlantic, above the equator. But now, particularly Portugal, Portugal is in a position where they largely depend on the protection of Great Britain. Great Britain is going to establish a pattern of behavior, being quite aggressive in um, protecting Portugal. When we look at Great Britain's campaigns during the Napoleonic Wars, for example, where they end up in Spain. I mean, it all starts with Great Britain really going to Portugal, right? Well, Portugal now is so dependent on British protection, British sea power. Portugal is in no place to argue with Britain when Britain basically says, "Okay, we want to operate below the equator now." Um, Again, another thing worth noting is that one of the main destinations for Portuguese slave trading ships was Brazil. Well, Brazil is going to become independent, and at that point, now we've got to start from square one essentially, because Brazil is not going to be bound by the treaty obligations between Portugal and Britain. Um, Another thing that's going to lead to increased effectiveness for the West Africa Squadron is medical developments. So quinine is going to reduce casualties due to tropical diseases. I cite a source at the end here, which is a National Institutes of Health a historical research paper, really, on the development of anti-malarial medicines through Great Britain's experiences in the tropics. Um, this is something relating it to the content that we covered in our class over the Scramble for Africa. What helped spark the Scramble for Africa? Well, the fact that medical developments had made it possible for European um, explorers and colonists to survive more effectively in Africa in the face of tropical diseases. Well, that helps the Royal Navy become more effective in terms of enforcing abolition on the high seas. Another thing too is steam power. We are going to see the introduction of steam powered ships in the West African Squadron. We're going to see more ships in general. Again, we're going to reach the high water mark, no pun intended, for the ship numbers in the West Africa Squadron during this time, with 30 ships on station. Compare that to 2 at the beginning and then 6 after the Napoleonic Wars. At this point, Great Britain is going to be dedicating quite literally a major portion. Some estimates vary, but in some years, as much of as a quarter of its entire budget devoted to the Royal Navy is going to be going to the West Africa Squadron. Now, this red star right here, that is the approximate site of the slave barracoons, or the slave trading station in Gainas, which is going to be targeted by Joseph Denman. Um, Joseph Denman is going to carry out this raid, if I'm not mistaken, in 1840. Um, and he is going to do it largely of his own initiative without any real official sanction. He's going to return to England, and he's going to be welcomed as a hero. And then a Spanish slaver is going to emerge and basically sue him for the destruction of his property. Now, the Royal Navy and the British government are not quite sure what to do about this. They place Denman on half pay, and the courts slug it out. And this court case basically is not going to be settled until 1848. But finally, in 1848, the courts will say, no, Joseph Denman didn't do anything wrong. What he did was within the law, and this is going to ultimately empower the West Africa Squadron to continue targeting the slaving stations on the West African coast, which is of course going to be a very effective development. Here we have a painting by James George Phillip from 1851, which depicts British men of war fighting vessels and shore-based artillery from the King of Lagos in 1851. And basically, long story short, um, this is an example of the British effecting regime change with the stated objective of installing a king in Lagos who would uh, agree to the abolishment of the slave trade. Again, there's all kinds of plans within plans and political complexities here. But as it relates to the West Africa Squadron, Joseph Denman's raid on Gainas, the slave station there, and then later his successful outcome in the trial that followed is going to um, open up the the slave trading stations to attack on the part of the Royal Navy. And we're going to see more and more actions carried out by the Royal Navy and the Royal Marines in which they are going to use steam-powered vessels to go right up those rivers and essentially attack the slave traders in a place where previously, for decades, they had believed that they were safe. Okay. Um, so that is a major development. Again, steam power. You see right here in this depiction of the bombardment of Lagos, again in 1851. This illustration is from 1852 from the Illustrated London News. This is a steam-powered ship. This is a steam-powered vessel right here. Here you see another one. You see the stack. On this one, it's quite notable that you see the paddle wheel positions amidships. Speaking of steam power, um, this is the HMS Hecate, which is the sister ship of the HMS Hydra. The HMS Hydra is the first Royal Navy paddle steamer that is going to be assigned to the West Africa Squadron. These ships are going to be able to catch slave trading ships that previously could get away because even when the wind slacks off, these steamers can still make good speed. They also entail their own set of difficulties and complexities because these steamers need coal, which means that now the Royal Navy needs to pre-position coal off the coast of West Africa. We need more coaling stations, and you're going to see them pop up in places like St. Helena and Ascension Island. Um, Again, steam power doesn't solve all the problems, but it's certainly going to be a development that helps the West Africa Squadron become more effective. Now, let's talk about supply and demand. We're getting close to the end here of this section. Why on earth am I showing you a picture of the Confederate bombardment of Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina, April 12th, 1861? This is the event that starts the American Civil War. Well, the Royal Navy has been trying to cut supply for decades at this point, with varying degrees of success. Obviously, success that has been increasing in the 1840s. But really, what needs to happen is that there needs to be a cut in demand. Well, the outbreak of the American Civil War is going to contribute to that tremendously. Without going too far off the track, at the beginning of the American Civil War, um, the North, Abraham Lincoln, the President of the United States, the war is initiated by the South, and Lincoln is going to essentially engage in war to try and preserve the Union. Ending slavery is not a stated objective at the beginning of the American Civil War. But after the Battle of Antietam, which proves to be the bloodiest day in American military history with 23,000 casualties in less than 24 hours, through the advice of people like Frederick Douglass, the former slave who becomes the great American abolitionist, Lincoln is going to threaten the South with the Emancipation Proclamation. And the Emancipation Proclamation is essentially what the South was afraid of as soon as Lincoln became president in 1860, in November of 1860. And of course, South Carolina secedes in December of 1860. Um, I explained this to my class, to my students, and I say, Lincoln is going to tell the South, hey, in your hands, not mine, my dissatisfied fellow citizens, is the question of civil war. I'm not going to start a war. It's not within my power as president to end slavery. Congress has to do that. I do want a limited spread, but I can't end slavery. But the South, of course, starts a war over the issue. But initially, like I said, the war is just about trying to preserve the Union from the Northern perspective. But after Antietam and the Emancipation Proclamation, which specifically threatens to set all of the enslaved people in the American Confederate States free, um, unless they lay down their weapons and stop fighting before January 1, 1863. The lines have been drawn, and the Civil War is now undeniably, in the eyes of the world and anyone who cares to look at it, the Civil War is a war about slavery. And of course, with the Union establishment of a blockade around the ports of the Confederacy, that market for the illegal slave trade from West Africa has now dried up. Because yes, of course, the slave trade technically had been outlawed by Jefferson going back in Congress, of course, going back to 1808, but the illegal slave trade had continued. But now, even though the American Navy had contributed what we could call a token force to the Royal Navy's West African Squadron starting really in the 1840s, um, it wasn't really designed to be effective, and its contribution was fairly. We could argue that it's inconsequential, but the U.S. Navy blockade of the Confederate ports, that is not inconsequential. That is going to effectively cut off the American South, this massive market for the slave trade, the transatlantic slave trade. That market is now dried up, which is of course going to be massively important. And then the abolition of slavery in the United States with the 13th Amendment in 1865 effectively ensures that that market cannot come back. Um, so all of this, together with the increasing effectiveness of the Royal Navy in the 1840s, is going to help end the Royal Navy's anti-slavery mission off the coast of West Africa. We talked about this map earlier. We saw this map. I'm going to place myself up here so I'm not in the way. We talked about how, okay, in 1865, that market dries up, the North American market. So obviously that's going to cut demand massively. And it is a good while later, but in 1888, the Brazilian market is going to dry up, largely because, again, diplomatic pressure. The British are actually going to send cruisers into waters off the coast of Brazil and essentially tell Brazil, hey, if you don't do something about the slave trade, we will. And there's going to be all kinds of diplomatic back and forth there. And Brazil is going to be very vulnerable to British diplomatic pressure and, of course, British naval power. So with these two massive markets essentially being removed from the picture, the Royal Navy's West African Squadron is essentially going to cease to exist, and the Royal Navy is going to turn its anti-slavery efforts. It's going to take the attention of its anti-slavery efforts to the East African slave trade, and that is where we are going to see the Royal Navy continue engaging in anti-slavery operations even after the end of the West Africa Squadron. For example, this is a wood engraving from 1881 that shows British sailors shelling an Arabian slave ship off the east coast of Africa. This particular picture is fascinating. In This is from 1907, and this is an East African victim of the Middle East slave trade who is having his leg irons removed by a sailor of the British Royal Navy aboard the HMS Sphinx. I couldn't find the photographer to credit. This is from 1907. So again, this shouldn't be any surprise given the fact that there's still human trafficking happening today. But I think it just goes to show that there is there's a the task of trying to suppress the slave trade. Yes, of course, in West Africa, which is the focus of this presentation, but also just everywhere and anywhere, is a massive, massive undertaking. So that takes us to the final section of this presentation, which is the legacy of the West Africa Squadron, how it's remembered. Surprisingly, it's not very well remembered. I have been blessed to travel to Great Britain twice in my life, and I visited every memorial and museum that I could fit into my time there. And there is not a single memorial to the West Africa Squadron anywhere in Britain. It's not a very well known part of the Royal Navy's history. And again, it's the subject of much debate. It's the subject of much controversy because, of course, no mention of the West Africa Squadron and its anti-slavery efforts is complete without also mentioning the fact that Great Britain is going to be one of the leading slave trading nations. And nevertheless, the 19th century Irish historian and essayist W.E.H. Lecky is going to say, Quote, the unweary, unostentatious, and inglorious crusade of England against slavery may probably be regarded as among the 3 or 4 perfectly virtuous pages comprised in the history of nations. Um, like I said earlier, there are going to be European powers that criticize um, Britain's anti slavery efforts as just a form of economic warfare. When you look at the numbers, though, the anti slavery campaign cost Great Britain the modern equivalent of billions with a B, of pounds. Um, and it was incredibly difficult. And the longest running campaign the Royal Navy has ever engaged in. And I think the author of one of the books that I used to source many of the images in this presentation and much of the information, Bernard Edwards, um, I think he said it really well when he said, "It may well be that the resolve of the British Parliament and the work of the African Squadron only acted as catalysts in the demise of slavery, but without their efforts, Africans would have been condemned to live in servitude for many more years to come." Again, all of this is subject to debate, and this is a very, this presentation is very, we're scratching the surface. There's so much more to discuss, but certainly, I believe that the West Africa Squadron was a gallant effort to end the evil practice of slavery. There's actually right now, as we speak, a movement in Great Britain to create a memorial for the West Africa Squadron in Portsmouth. And what you see here is a scale model of what they want a bronze sculpture to look like. A large bronze sculpture that they want to set up there in Portsmouth. And it's largely crowdfunded. There are some notable members of the British government who have committed to provide funding through their own money to this. But this is currently, this is something that's going on right now, which I find very interesting. There are memorials scattered throughout Britain's colonial possessions, former colonial possessions, such as Saint Helena, which is still part of, if I'm not mistaken, the Commonwealth. This is a picture from 2021, and this is Commander Tom Boix. He's the executive officer of the HMS Protector, and he's laying a wreath at the HMS Waterwitch Memorial. The HMS Waterwitch was a ship assigned to the West Africa Squadron, and this memorial in particular is a memorial to the men of the ship who died while on station. Um, the work of the West Africa Squadron was incredibly difficult. They were outnumbered. They were, despite the fact that their efforts were extremely expensive in terms of the British Royal Navy budget, they're still pretty well underfunded. They were undermanned, um, and they were fighting a very, very difficult, exhausting marathon battle, um, and that they were able to have a meaningful impact on the slave trade, I think is remarkable. Again, they don't end the transatlantic slave trade; they suppress the transatlantic slave trade, and even through all their efforts, I mean, the entire Royal Navy would have had a hard time halting the slave trade. It was just so so massive in scale, um, and to an observer, it's, I can totally see why somebody would say, well, this is, they only stopped 6 or 10% of the trade. That's really not that impressive, and yet that 6 or 10%, I believe, had a very significant impact. The fact that Great Britain was able or willing to become the first major European power to combat the slave trade, and the fact that Britain was willing and and capable of leveraging great diplomatic pressure, um, I think is remarkable. And overall, I think the story of the West Africa Squadron is a remarkable bit of history that deserves to be remembered by any student of history, particularly anyone interested in the history of the African continent or the transatlantic slave trade. Now, As far as a call to action, anyone who is watching this presentation, I would heartily recommend some of the sources that I used. I'm going to list them all here at the end in my bibliography, particularly the works or the book by Bernard Edwards. I really, really enjoyed his book. It was a great starting point that then launched me off into lots of other excellent books and articles. Um, I think really the story of the West Africa Squadron is a story that deserves to be remembered, it deserves to be told, it deserves to be analyzed and debated and examined. Also, the problem of slavery and exploitation and human trafficking is not something that is confined to the history books, unfortunately. It's something that continues to this day. This is a 2023 report, which is using data going back to 2020, published by the United Nations, which kind of shows us very quickly that slavery is still a worldwide problem. Um, it is, I believe that slavery is perhaps one of the worst manifestations of the unfortunate human tendency to to be awful towards other humans, and that's still a problem today. Human trafficking is a problem. Um, I live in Texas, and human trafficking is a major problem with the unsecured southern border. So I think really, just like we have virtuous abolitionists such as William Wilberforce working to do something about the transatlantic slave trade. And even though the solutions they came up with were not perfect, Granville Sharp is famous for his belief and his funding of the colonies that would be established in places like Liberia and Sierra Leone, and those colonies for former slaves ultimately were, they largely ended in failure. There was all kinds of difficulties attached to that. Nevertheless, the work of people like Granville Sharp and William Wilberforce, I think, ultimately had a positive impact. Um, Virtuous people, good people, can change history, and I think that's part of the reason why I love studying history and why I think it's worth knowing your history, because we can be those people in our time, because there's still a need. There will always be a need. There's still problems. Slavery is unfortunately still with us. Slavery was not abolished in, for example, Oman until 1970. I believe that Mauritania did not abolish slavery until the 1980s. And it doesn't matter, all these countries around the world largely have abolished slavery, but slavery still exists. It just looks different now, but it's still the same old evil thing, and we still need good people in the world to combat it wherever it is found. Now, here's my works cited. Like I said, I really really recommend these works, particularly Bernard Edwards, The Royal Navy versus the Slave Traders. I also very much enjoyed um, the interview actually with historian Andrew Lambert, which detailed the campaign against the slave trade. It's very much worth a watch. Um, I really, really enjoyed working on this presentation. One of the first assignments that I did in grad school was actually a report on the West Africa Squadron, and I think it's come full circle in that this presentation is actually my final coursework apart from comprehensive exams for my master's degree, and I think it's uh, it's neat that I get to come full circle and finish with this again, with the West Africa Squadron, and with a much better understanding of how it fits into the rich story of Africa. And I've thoroughly enjoyed this course. So thank you very much for your attention, and I hope that this presentation was edifying, and hope it was worth your time. So thank you very much, and have a great day.